Hello, everyone, and welcome to worship. We're going to be continuing our series on Googling God, and answering the question today is, does the Old Testament really apply today? We're going to be looking at like the Old Testament versus the New Testament. So, I know I'm not Jeff. I'm Adam, and I'm
Hi.
joined by.
I am shy. I'm also not Jeff. Sorry.
She's also not Jeff, but we're going to be discussing that today, kind of tag teaming it, pinging off of each other some ideas, and hopefully leading this discussion. And then from here, you guys can answer some questions as well. So we're going to jump right into it. We got a lot to talk about. So we're going to start off with the idea of a covenant or testament. Okay, so the idea of, we talk about the New Testament versus the Old Testament, but I don't think a lot of us understand what like a testament is. In looking at the testaments, they're like the contracts, almost like a contract. I like to call them the New Covenant and the Old Covenant because there was a promise that God made with people back then. So there was the old way that he used to do the contract with his people, where he would ask them to follow his laws, give sacrifices, and in return he would protect them, give them blessings and whatnot. And that was kind of the old contract. And now we're going to look at the new contract or the new covenant with Jesus. So, thoughts on that?
I think a lot of the concept of the old covenant versus the new covenant really inspires this concept of morality and where we start our journey with religion versus our journey with Jesus. I think it's a really important topic to dive into.
Right, because so many people nowadays think that we have to follow a list of rules, or they don't understand that. So, one thing we want to make very clear from the very beginning is that when Jesus came, he says that he came to what we call fulfill the law. And he says that himself in Matthew 5:17-20. He says, don't misunderstand why I have come. Jesus is actually talking to the Pharisees at this point, and the Pharisees back then were a bunch of religious people who followed the laws. They followed the letter of the law, so much so that they were very much focused on just the law and how they looked in everyone else's eyes. So Jesus is talking to that crew, and he says, don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. So I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least of these commandments and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least of the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so he's saying that to them to say, hey, you can try to follow the law as much as you want, but that's not really what's going to get you into the kingdom of heaven. You have to have so much righteousness that it's near impossible. There's only one guy who did it, and he was the sacrifice for all of our sins. So,
yeah. Kind of an important dude.
Kind of important guy. So, in looking at kind of the purpose of the law, we're looking at why do we even have the law to begin with? Like, what's the difference between the two? And it says here that in Romans 7:7, or let's just start off with Romans 7:6. And Shai was really nice to kind of point these out here. Romans 7:6, it's coming from Paul, and he's talking about the purpose of the law. So Jesus said that he came to accomplish it, which means that he came to take that contract that he had made and put a seal on it at the end and say that this contract is now done, it's been fulfilled, now we're going to start the new contract, the new covenant with God. And so he kind of talks about it in Romans 7:6. Did you have that?
Mm-hmm.
You want to go ahead and read that?
But now we have been released from the law, since we have died to what held us, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law.
Right. And so what Paul is essentially saying here, and this is so, like, we debated this when we were talking about it, like, we really wanted to read all of chapter 7 because it's just so good. It talks about the purpose of the law. So I challenge you, maybe during your whatever time that you have discussion time afterwards, read that. Like, read chapter 7 and kind of go into, we won't do it now for time's sake, but look into that whole thing. But what he's talking about there is, we've been released from the law. Like, we no longer have to. We no longer have to follow that old law anymore.
And it's because of Jesus' sacrifice. It's because of his death that we are able to transition into this newer
Right, because of what he has done, he has become that ultimate sacrifice, basically putting a cap on the end of that old way of doing things to where he has become the ultimate sacrifice. We no longer have to offer those sacrifices anymore. And so he moves on then to say, then what's the purpose of the law? And he says the purpose of the law then in Romans 7, well then, I'm suggesting that the law, or he says, well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me sin. I would never have known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, you must not covet. So one of the main purposes of why we talk about the Old Testament and why it's still in our Bibles is because it points out our sin. It builds us that foundation that we can then build upon for our morality. It gives us that starting block of where to go from here.
Which is towards Jesus.
Exactly, to point us all towards Jesus. So looking then at some other passages, then in Hebrews 8:13. Do you have that one?
I do.
All right, go for it.
Hebrews 8:13.
Yep.
In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away.
Right. So when God says that this new covenant, those old laws that we had, they're no longer binding to us. They've kind of like are flittering away. And because of verses like this, actually historically, there was a lot of debate as to whether or not the Old Testament should even be included in the Bible. Because they were like, we have all of these letters from Paul, we have all of these gospel accounts from all of the people who followed Jesus, and do we really need the Old Testament? And everyone was like, almost unanimously like, actually, yeah, because none of this stuff in the New Testament makes sense unless you understand the Old.
It's not relevant. There's no reason for us to even kind of consider it if we don't have a baseline for why we're considering it.
Right. We don't. It's one of those things where you don't know you need the cure until you know you're sick, kind of thing. It's almost backwards. Like you can preach people a cure, but until they know that they're sick, until they know what's wrong, then we can't do anything with it. So then moving on into Hebrews 9:15. Do you have that one?
I can get it.
That'd be great. Looking at Hebrews 9:15, the writer of Hebrews continues to talk about Christ's role in that covenant now between us.
Hebrews 9:15.
9:15, yeah.
Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant.
Okay, so again, that first covenant shows us sin. It shows us what we've done wrong. It is the morality, it's the written morality kind of God. And then it shows us that we're wrong, and because there's nothing that we can do that is right, then Jesus is the one who fulfilled that law. He made sure that our sacrifice, we can't do anything on our own. So Jesus was the one to be that person for us. So he could be that sacrifice for us, so we don't have to suffer anymore. We don't have to die eternally, because he's the one who has taken all that sin away. And it says here that he was the one who mediates that new covenant, and that idea is not just a lawyer who stands in the courtroom of God and says, my client, although he is guilty, we propose this alternate plan for him. That mediator was somebody who actually would go to the judge and say, yes, he is guilty, I will take all of his punishment for him. But Jesus did that for every human being across all time, all at the same time. He did it for everyone.
Yeah, and a pretty important dude.
Right, exactly. Very important. So now moving forward, it teaches us that baseline for morality. And going into, I like to think of it almost like an analogy of a person. So if we think of humanity, if humanity was going to be compared to like a human child, let's take this analogy, okay? So think about it. When a human person is born, they are completely and 100% dependent upon the mother and father to take care of them, right? I mean, they have to be fed, they have to be wiped, they have to be cradled and put to sleep, they have to be burped. I mean, the child can't even burp itself without throwing up. There's a lot of stuff that child's dependent upon the parents for. The same way is true for humanity. In the first part of humans' existence on planet, we were completely dependent upon God for everything. In the Garden of Eden, our rules were very, very simple. Then as we kind of got into our terrible twos phase, as humans we get into terrible twos and we start saying no, 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 and we become bratty. I almost like to think of the terrible twos around the time of Noah, whenever Noah was the only righteous person and God had to wipe the world clean and start over. Seems a little harsh, but it's God's perspective, not ours. He sees the bigger picture and the bigger plan, and because of that, we learned. And anyone who knows, like, coming out of the terrible twos, by the time a child is 2 years old, they know who's in charge. Is it mom and dad, or is it them? And God in history showed that it was him in charge. So then we see after that some more descendants until eventually we start to get to the point where the kid needs rules, and every child needs to have structure and support in order for that child to be successful and feel safe. And so the same thing was true for humanity. God started putting rules in place in order for humanity to have a structure to build upon. Now sometimes we have no clue what those rules mean. Like when we were little kids, we didn't understand the purpose of getting a shot. I mean, let's be honest. We'd have to go to the doctor and get shot, but there was a reason for it.
Mommy, why?
They're just hurting me. But there's a reason for it. The same thing is true with some of those Levitical laws. The old laws were there for a reason. Don't eat shellfish. Well, we found out, like, if Jeff were to eat shellfish, he would know that he was allergic on the first time, and then there would be no more Jeff. Like, it would be, it's a sad, sad deal. And so there were rules put in place. Pork, there was a whole bunch of laws against pork because pork had such a dangerous bacteria back then because they couldn't preserve it. Other things that they couldn't eat.
You go into tattoos as well. Tattoos at
Right.
the time meant something completely different.
Right.
They represented idolatry towards other, quote, gods,
Right.
as well as the fact that it was very unhealthy at the time as well.
Yes.
So there's all these different rules that come to play based off of the timeline. You just have to know that timeline.
Right, and so that's getting into our next part too, because like, how would we know all of this stuff? And we're going to finish this up today with a little short synopsis on what we call hermeneutics. But learning a little bit about that history back then, and even how they do tattoos back then, you understand now why, that was probably a good idea they didn't do it. Because God was trying to establish a foundation with his people, a core belief that they needed to be separate. They needed to be the ones to bring other people to the light. And they needed to bring people to the light to show them the correct way by being separate and living differently than they did. And so as you evolve as a person and getting to know your own parents, your relationship with them starts to evolve as well. And so those rules start to become not lax, but they evolve and they grow into much deeper meaning. And so as you're entering your young adult or your preteen years into your teenage years, those rules are still there, but parents start to become a little more lax on them. Maybe they let you go to bed a little bit later, deciding your own bedtime, picking out your own clothes. You get a lot more freedoms. And we see that throughout history of the Old Testament as well. We see the people of God start to get a little more freedoms. And we see God starting to almost scold them for just blindly following the rules. In Psalms 51, we hear David cry out to God and says, it's not the sacrifices that you want, or I would bring them, but the sacrifice to you, God, is a broken and contrite heart. And so we see it also in Isaiah. He talks about, I don't want your offerings, I want you. And so the idea is God is looking for that deeper relationship. We start to see that as humanity evolves. And then humanity goes through its teenage years in the Babylon. They get kind of carted off to Babylon for their ill mistakes and rebelling against their parents and saying, I don't want anything to do with you, God. And God's like, okay, fine, here are your consequences. And they have to go into exile for a while. And they learn from it. And they come back and they rebuild Jerusalem. And they're with God, throughout the rest of their teenage years until they're starting to reach young adulthood when Christ comes. And if any of you who are young adults, like we're young adults here, know that your relationship with your parents starts to change once you've reached that point of young adulthood. Because let's be honest, you don't have to follow any of your parents' rules anymore. You don't have to. Like I can go visit my parents and they can say, all right, you need to be in bed by 8. And I'll go, no. Nice try. And that's what we're talking about when it comes to the Old Testament versus the New Testament, is in the Old Testament times, those laws it's not that they don't really apply anymore, but we have since grown past them. And we now have a deeper connected relationship with Christ. And so when we come back now to go visit our parents, when we're going to, see our parents, we follow the rules of their house, not out of obligation or out of, even because this is what I have to do. It's more of out of respect for them, out of honor and love of our parents, we follow those rules. And the good news is, while on earth we may have broken parents who make some very silly rules or they make mistakes, our Heavenly Father is a perfect parent, and He never makes any of those mistakes. So He doesn't have silly rules or ridiculous laws that we have to follow. And so we are now in this new covenant, this new relationship with Christ. And while we are not equals, because I don't even see myself equal with my own parents, I still love and respect them, and we can have deeper conversations now, but they are still my parents. Like, they are still have that higher authority in my life. And I still want to honor and respect that, even though I'm my own man and can make my own rules. And that's the kind of relationship we can have with God as well, where God is still in charge, and we follow now these Old Testament laws, not out of, obligation or even spite or even frustration.
Or even culture,
or
based
culture,
off of
right.
just because that's what we're told to do, or that's our past. But out of our love for Jesus, out of our desire to be closer to Him.
Yes, and so since we want to now have that relationship, we do follow these Old Testament laws. And so looking now, moving forward, Shai had a very good point that she brought up too, which is kind of summarized in 1 Corinthians 6:12. Paul's talking to people in Corinth, and he says, "You say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though, quote, I'm allowed to do anything, I cannot become a slave to anything." So the concept is, we have now the freedom to do a lot of stuff we couldn't have done in younger humanity's years. But the question is now, should we? And it becomes a matter of the heart. It becomes a matter of, why are we going to do it? What's our purpose?
Right. Is there really a need to do that? Because if you're doing it, you're typically doing it for a purpose. If you're not getting closer to God and it's not for God and for His glory, then there's absolutely no reason in doing it. So maybe, yeah, you can do it, but should you be? Or should you be possibly doing something else to bring glory to God?
Exactly. Great way to sum that up. So now we're going to look then at how can we, and this is kind of a small wrap up before we break into our discussions, and you guys talk about the Old Testament laws. This is going to transition into next week as well, because we have questions for you now. So now we can get into the specifics. Now that we kind of have an overview of how to interpret the Old and New Testament, there have been some questions that have been posed to us, and some questions we might want to ask. But I'm going to put it back into your hands and have you guys take a week to go home and try to research some of this on your own. And I'll show you how to research and some basic stuff you can do here in just a second. But let's look at some of these questions. What does the Bible say about tattoos? What does the Bible say about sex before marriage? Homosexuality? All of those sexual immoral things put together. What does it say about abortion? Euthanasia? Suicide? Mental illness? Divorce? All of this stuff. A lot of people have these questions, and we go, what does the Bible really say about all this stuff?
And they're much more modern topics. These are things that are still relevant in today's society, rather than questioning whether you can boil a goat in its mother's milk or not.
Right.
Is possibly not our best use of time when that's not relevant in today's society, whereas these topics are.
Right. And so the thing is, the Bible does not a lot of times we go to the Bible as if it were a textbook to say, all right, if I go to page 347, it's going to tell me the rule to follow on whatever topic. And that's not how the Bible was written. And so a lot of these are not going to have a direct, simple yes or no answer. There's not a verse in the Bible that says, abortion is bad, period.
But euthanasia is okay.
But euthanasia is okay, yeah. It doesn't say that. So we'll be looking at those next week, but I want you guys to go home and start researching some of those. So here's how we can do it. A little topic called hermeneutics. And it won't take very long. It's kind of a basic thing. But things to remember about hermeneutics. 1, what was the purpose of the book that is being written? When you're reading that text, what was its purpose? So I like to think of it almost like genre. I mentioned this before, I mention it all the time, but if I want to learn about whales, I don't go read Moby Dick. Because while Moby Dick is about a whale, it doesn't tell me the things I want to know about whales. It just has a whale in it. You know, if I want to learn about, if I want to learn about ancient Roman times, I'm not going to go to Gladiator. Because while that's a great movie, it's not a historical book on how gladiators were actually fought back then. And I think sometimes we get that confused. When we go to the Bible and books of the Bible, sometimes we go to the Bible with our idea of looking at what that book needs to be. And that's not what we need to do. We need to look at the book itself and let the books of the Bible, the God's Word itself, explain to us. And that's what we call exegesis. That's a big fancy word called exegesis, which means letting the book speak what it needs to speak in its text. Okay? And so when we're going to it, we need to understand the meaning of the book and the genre. We need to understand what its audience was. Okay, who are they trying to talk to? Some of them are pretty straightforward. Like, I, Paul, the disciple, am speaking to the churches in Corinth. Okay, there we go. That was pretty easy.
Paul was pretty straightforward.
Paul was pretty straightforward. But, we think about some other texts, too. Like, were they speaking to a Gentile audience? Were they speaking to a Jewish audience? Were they speaking to non-believers? Were they speaking to believers? That stuff can be very helpful in understanding, like, oh, okay, because you talk differently depending on what your audience is. So you look at the audience, you look at the author. Who is the author? Sometimes the author is very clear. I, Paul. Okay, it's Paul. Sometimes the author is not so clear, like Hebrews. We don't really know who wrote Hebrews. The author will also take into consideration as well. And where was the author? What was happening to the author at the time? Sometimes, again, it tells you. Paul says, I write this in chains whenever he was in Philippians. So he's chained up. He's in jail. Good thing to know when he's reading the text. It makes the whole thing make much more sense. So know the author, maybe know the author's intent, but also read the whole book or verses in context. Because you can take one verse and just pull it completely out of context, and it means something totally different than what you originally meant. So I have an example here. I'm going to bring a photo up to the camera so you can see it here. Okay? So here we have a nice picture of a person. I don't want to cover up Shy here. We have a kid riding a bike, correct? Okay? Well then, I'm going to show you a little more. No big deal. We're going to show you a little more of the picture. Oh, look. Now he's about to do a little trick on a ramp. Okay, maybe that's not the best idea. And especially whenever we get to the whole picture. I don't know if you can see the nice gentleman down there laying down on the ramp, but when you get the whole picture, it kind of changes the context of what you're seeing. And sometimes we see a verse in the Bible and we just, we see that one thing, we're like, oh yeah, that's what it means. Close the Bible, we're done. No, read it around it.
A great example being Jeremiah 29:11.
There you go. Well, tell us about that.
Jeremiah 29:11 is probably the most misquoted or misused, I should say, verse in the Bible. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you.
That sounds great.
Right. Plans give you hope in the future. I'm like, wow, life is going to be amazing.
Right.
God's planned out this great life for me. Awesome.
I have a hope in the future.
Right. But if you read on, you realize it's not exactly that simple. Mm-hmm. It's not really how it's laid out, and you do have to seek God. You do have to seek Him with your whole heart, but once you do, you're going to find Him. Right,
and you have to understand the context. God was using that verse as a verse of hope for the people who were in exile.
Right, exactly. It's not meant for me going through a rough semester in grad school, and, everything's going to be great, and I'm going to graduate with honors and flowers and rainbows.
Right.
But, for those particular people...
Right, they needed that.
Yes.
And so, does that mean that we can't use that verse to make ourselves feel better? No. But I think sometimes we take it and just as a simple one-liner, like we use it as like an inspirational, motivational quote. But that has so much more context the more you read it, and you realize that there is an entire story wrapped around it, and there's a people group that were using it. And when you understand their plight, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It was for them.
It was for them, yeah. And so that's kind of an example of what we look at. So when you're doing hermeneutics this week, I'm actually going to put some links in the video description here on YouTube. And then I will also put it in the Facebook group for those people who are watching. I'll try to make like a Google document or something anyone can use. It'll have a bunch of links of different resources you can use if you want to start reading the Bible for yourself. And I challenge you this week, your challenge is to go out and really start to read the Bible, because we don't know the answers that we seek until we actually go to the source that has the answers. And so we'll look at some of those questions next week, but we're going to turn it over to you and go ahead and let you guys discuss what the next part is. What do you guys think about what we've talked about today? What is your view of the Old Testament, New Testament? How does that apply to you today? What questions do you have? So we'll go ahead, turn it over to you guys.